All right, good evening, everyone. Hope everyone can hear me okay. We're crossing our fingers for technology tonight. Welcome to the second presentation of Underwood Conservation District's Winter Workshop Series. And this is actually a collaborative workshop with Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group as part of their Winter Speaker Series. Thank you all for being here. My name is Tova Tillinghast, and I'm the Underwood Conservation District Manager. Tonight we'll learn all about beavers and their fascinating behaviors and how they can benefit watersheds locally. All right. So, as I mentioned, we have a winter workshop series going on, and Mid-Columbia Fish Enhancement Group has their winter speaker series as part of their usual seasonal activities. And you can see here what they have planned. Quite a great lineup we're very excited about. I'm having trouble with all my buttons here. And then we're excited about our lineup going forward. In December, we already learned about backyard conservation and living with wildlife, including our Yard by Yard program that is new at UCD. And in February, we're excited to learn about how forest landowners can access the carbon market. And we'll be sharing a lot of other good forest management resources for landowners. We also look forward to a workshop in March about farmland succession planning. And this is a critical step for any family managing acreage. So stay tuned for details. Actually, you don't need to stay tuned. As of today, we got that date and time settled with our speaker. So for all upcoming workshops, please register in advance to attend, just like you did here. And then this workshop, along with all these others, are being recorded. So they'll be available to view on the internet. So our workshops will be available on our webpage under news and events. And we'll also have the slides available for future viewing. So while I have you, I'm going to talk briefly about our native plant sale. And it does relate to the topic tonight because we'll be talking about native vegetation a bit in the presentation. And our native plant sale is ongoing just through the end of February, but order early because we have sold out of a few species. So you can check our webpage and see what's still available there. Plant pickup this year will be on Saturday, March 19th in White Salmon. We also hope to have our Tree Fest again this year, and that's including a day of sale. So if you can't find what you want on our inventory online, we do plan to have some of those species available at Tree Fest on March 19th. And you can find all of the most recent news and updates from us by signing up for the UCD newsletter on our webpage. And with that, we'll get started with some of the details of our presentation. With me here is Jan Thomas. She's a resource specialist at UCD, and she will be our moderator for tonight's presentation, thankfully. She is now going to describe a few logistics as we get started.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. As Tova mentioned, my name is Jan Thomas, and I'm going to be here in the background, kind of helping with the moderation. Tova talked about it a little bit, but I just want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and that recording will be posted online next week along with presentation materials. So if you want to revisit it or share it with someone who couldn't be here tonight, it'll be available for you. Just a kind of logistical detail here, we're in a meeting format, so everyone does have control of their own mute and camera functions. So I'm going to ask that everyone check their settings, make sure that you're muted, and make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation so we can reduce background noise and really give the stage to our presenters. That said, though, we definitely encourage your participation and your questions tonight. So we invite you to enter your questions just as they come to you. You can put them in the chat box. I'm going to be gathering those for each presenter, and we're going to have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the evening. When we move into that Q&A, also invite anyone who just wants to ask their question verbally to use that raise your hand feature, which you're going to find at the bottom of your screen in the reactions menu there. So you can raise your hand and then we'll just call on folks in turn if you want to just ask your question rather than type it into the questions box. So we'll save questions for the end and you have those two options. We're also going to have several polls for you this evening. Those should just pop up right on your screen and disappear for you once you've clicked on your answers. Responses to the polls are completely anonymous, but I'll share a summary of the results with everybody just right after each of the polls. And then we're all familiar now, but as some of you may have experienced, Zoom sometimes has a mind of its own with regard to sound. Particularly. So if that happens that you all of a sudden can't hear us, just logging out and logging back in is usually going to fix the problem for you. You also do always have the option of calling in with your phone to get the audio piece. If you're having any technical difficulties, just feel free to put them in the chat box and I can help troubleshoot on the side with you. But hopefully everything goes smoothly. We'll keep our fingers crossed. And I think that's everything I have. So I'll turn it back over to you, Tova.
All right. Thank you, Jan. All right. So as we found last year, the online platform for our workshops worked pretty well. And of course, we miss seeing everyone face to face, but the benefits of being at home hopefully include sipping on your favorite beverage and sitting by the fire with your feet up. So sit back and relax and enjoy. We are excited to see increased participation through these events actually and a broader geographic reach with these workshops. So those are a couple positive outcomes from these new and different times we're in. And to get started, we'd love to know a little bit more about you in the audience, especially where you're located, so that we understand generally where you're from, whether that's the Columbia River Gorge or Yakima Valley or beyond. So we're going to put up a quick poll for you to select an answer from. And again, it's an anonymous poll. So I think Jan's going to be able to put that up.
Yep, it's up there now. So just log your answer and looks like we've got most people voted here. We'll just wait a couple more seconds and give folks a chance to weigh in here. I think that's pretty much everyone, and I'll share the results here. Tova, I don't know if you can see those. Sometimes you can't see the polls, but we've got about 30% from Klickitat County, a few folks from Skamania and Benton County, and then pretty evenly split at about 15 to 20% in Yakima, Kittitas, Hood River, and then some others out there joining us. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now to get you oriented to us, we'll introduce ourselves a little bit more, and this will be very brief. Underwood Conservation District, that's us. Jan and I are coming from White Salmon tonight, and here you can see our mission is to engage landowners and land users throughout Skamania and West Klickitat counties in the voluntary conservation, enhancement, stewardship, and sustainable use of natural resources. So we are a local public agency. We're neutral and non-regulatory, and we have a local board of supervisors that guides and directs our work. So we're very thankful to our volunteer board of supervisors, as well as the volunteer landowners that work with us to enhance natural resources through this area. And this is our region, our district area, which includes all of Skamania County and the western portion of Klickitat County. So it's quite a large area. We do tend to focus on the private lands. While there's a lot of national forest in our district area, we're focused on those private lands for the most part. I'll hand it over to Margaret here now for her brief introduction.
Hi, everyone. This is Margaret Newman from Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group. So excited to be here, and we're co-hosting tonight's top talk with UCD. And in case you aren't familiar with our nonprofit, our mission is to protect and restore wild salmon and steelhead populations in our region through restoration, protection, education, and community involvement. And we work in South Central Washington on the Wind, the white salmon, the Klickitat, and the Yakima rivers. So we have a really big region, and we have staff in the Gorge and in the Yakima Basin and board members throughout. And some of those folks are here with us tonight. And I guess the one good thing about digital meetings is that we can bring people together from all over the place. So, and I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jeanette Burkhart with Yakima Nation.
Thank you, Margaret. And thanks to both Underwood Conservation District and Mid-Columbia Fisheries Enhancement Group for hosting this awesome topic, and Alexa Whipple at Methow Beaver Project for lending her tremendous experience and expertise on this to the evening's content. So first of all, I wanted to say that my name is Jeanette Burkhart. I am a watershed planner for the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program, and I work in the Yakima Nation's southern territories, which I'll show you in a second. And I'm also a member of the Wish Push Working Group, which is involved with beavers, and you'll be learning more about that momentarily. I certainly don't purport to be a beaver expert, but I'm a beaver enthusiast, and I'm excited that this is an area of interest for the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program. So our mission statement is up there: to preserve, protect, enhance, and restore culturally important fish populations throughout the zone of influence of the Yakima Nation, and to protect the right of the Yakima Nation members to utilize these resources as reserved for them in the Treaty of 1855. And so the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program is a natural resource program of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation. And that work is guided by science and traditional ecological knowledge. And as some of you may know, Yakima are salmon people, and beavers are salmon's allies. So next, please. Could you advance the slide?
I would like to, except my computer has frozen. There we go. Sorry about that.
Just for those of you who may not be familiar, this is a map of Washington State showing both the Yakima Reservation and the ceded lands of the Yakima Territory as set out in the Treaty of 1855. And in that lower portion, next please, is the southern territories of those ceded lands. And these are the watersheds that I work in, and the Wish Push Working Group concentrates our efforts, at least currently, on the watersheds of the Wind, white salmon, Tat, Rock Creek primarily. So thanks.
So Jeanette mentioned the Wish Push Working Group, and that group is a collaboration of Yakima Nation, Mid-Columbia Fisheries, Mount Adams Resource Stewards, Underwood Conservation District, and others. And we were super excited to come together and talk about beavers tonight, because we are all beaver enthusiasts, and just and excited to have Alexa here. So that group, the name Wish Push comes from, it's named for the beaver in the Yakima creation stories. And the group is working to respect and retain and rehome beavers in that area that Jeanette described, kind of the Washington side of the gorge. The group envisions abundant beaver populations that provide healthier and more resilient watersheds for the benefit of fish, wildlife, and humans. So we're working to develop an understanding of existing beaver populations and identify and prioritize sites where beaver can provide habitat benefits without conflicts to infrastructure, and helping landowners and land managers retain beavers on the landscape relocating problem beavers and monitoring what happens, and restoring headwaters for future beaver relocations or releases.
Thanks, Margaret. So to get us started, Jan has another quick poll for us to see where we are with the beginning of this meeting, what our perception of beaver is tonight at the beginning of the presentation.
Yeah, so folks, the poll is up there. You should be able to see that and log your answer. And I just want to take a moment here while we're doing that. We've had quite a few people join us in the last few minutes, so just want to let you all know that we welcome your questions at any time in the chat box. We're going to hold questions until the end when we have kind of a dedicated Q&A, but you can enter in them as they occur to you in the chat, and we'll read them out at the end. We'll also be able to unmute ourselves and just ask directly if that's your preference at the end of the presentations, but until then we ask that you do keep yourself on mute. We just have a few more people here who haven't voted, so let's give it another second or two and then I'll share the results here. Okay, well, we have an overwhelming majority of folks who has responded that perspective of beaver is primarily a beneficial keystone species. We have a couple answers for fur-bearing game species and then also a couple of other in there. So looking good to start it off with, folks.
All right, Margaret, you are up for the introduction of our star speaker tonight.
I will get unmuted here. What a big honor it is to get to introduce Alexa Whipple. She's a restoration ecologist and director of the Methow Beaver Project. Alexa works for sustainability in all practices, and she works for process-based solutions to challenging environmental conditions. She's lived in the Methow for 20 years, but has worked across the Western US, studying songbirds, carnivores, plant communities, and agricultural impacts on habitat and wildlife. And wildfire impacts on Western riparian ecosystems. Alexa completed her MS in riparian ecology at Eastern Washington University, where she focused on beaver ecology and beaver-mediated restoration in degraded and wildfire impacted streams in the Methow River watershed. So we've got a superstar with us.
Thank you so much, Margaret and Jeanette, Tova, everyone who I've had the honor of getting to know. Sharon, I saw you were on the call as well. Dallas, just folks I've gotten to know in the area in Southern Washington that I've grown a lot from and learned a lot from you all as well, and the varying challenges we face in different parts of this beautiful state we live in. And I saw someone's from Alaska too. Lots of beavers up there. We'd like more. Like you have. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully this will go swimmingly. And get it into slideshow mode. Great, Margaret. Thank you for that thumbs up. I was going to ask for that. Okay, so I am here to talk about the many benefits of beavers. It sounds like from that poll, a lot of you already see that the beavers are keystone species. I am not known for my brevity when talking about beavers, but I'm going to do my best to cover a lot of 30,000 foot elevation ideas around beavers and facts and strategies for living with, restoring landscapes with, partnering with beavers. So if there's anything you want to know more about, throw that in the chat with questions. If you want to reach out to anyone on this workshop, including me, later for more information, always feel free to do so. That is one of our biggest agendas at the Methow Beaver Project, is to share what we know and learn from others. So here we go. The mission at the Meadow Beaver Project, I just want to throw this out there, is that we do partner with native beavers as well as our communities to adapt to the changing climate and the predicted impacts, the ones we're feeling already, but the ones that are still coming down the line in support of people, biodiversity, the environment, and sustainable ecosystem function. That's the big one. We want to stay around, and we want all the species we love and rely on to be around too. Before I get too more in depth, I do want to recognize the Meto and Okanagan people. They are 2 of the tribes of the 12 Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, whose ancestral lands we live on and work on and occupy. And our project is very committed to working with the Meto and Okanagan people for ecological as well as cultural restoration on our landscapes and in our watersheds. So while we're looking at this beautiful photo of the Methow River watershed, I wanted to have you all think about this watershed as a 3-legged stool. It got here for multiple reasons, but the 3 main ones that we can think of are the geology of this beautiful planet and our state and region, the hydrology that exists because of oceans and currents and air currents, water currents, and the beautiful cycles that we all live with in different parts of this state. But biology is not always thought of as a critical leg in this 3-legged stool, but it is. Plants, for sure. Woody plants in particular, absolutely. Structure in our streams. But there's another huge player. Most of you on this workshop already recognize this, but beavers are not recognized on a large scale as one of the most impactful biological community members to play a role in our watershed function. Primarily, we really value them and need to value them more for their ability to store water, slow it down, spread it out on the landscape, keep it around longer. There's a fancy term, increasing water residency time. It really matters. It matters a ton. Let's review the water cycle just a little bit. Most of you all know this, but it's been a while since we all had high school science. Our oceans are taking up most of the water, existing water on this planet. Fresh water is only 3% of the Earth's water. Only 1% of that is surface or groundwater. The rest is stored as ice. That's changing pretty rapidly, but the landscape has changed as well, where our streams are fairly degraded. So going from ice or snow to the ocean is a pretty quick trip these days. What I want to help make sure everybody leaves here tonight with knowing is that when beavers are on the landscape, you are slowing that water down, keeping it around anywhere from 700 to 400 times longer than in most of our degraded streams that are a straight shot, more like a log flume going down to the ocean. So by the end of this workshop, I'm really hoping that everyone walks away with wanting to help us learn to coexist with beavers on a larger scale than we do currently, because they used to be around in much greater numbers. And we'll cover that in a little bit, but it's a little staggering when you learn how impactful they were in the past and our ecological amnesia, not really understanding the role they played because we don't see them around anymore. And we'll get into more of that, the whys of that in a little bit. But I do want to talk about the incredible value of water in supporting the immense biodiversity in freshwater systems that we see across this planet. In North America and Northern Europe and even Northern to Central Asia, beavers have played a huge role in providing the habitat that supports incredible biodiversity. Water is life. It is life for so many things. Otters, bears, cougars, so predators, prey species, waterfowl. One of the most amazing prey species for otter that are in most of our beaver systems here, a native crayfish. We only have one in Washington state, and it's in most of our beaver complexes, the signal crayfish. Amazing. Great blue herons. I love this triptych. So here's the first one, second one, diving head first into what you see, all the plants on the right, is an underwater food cache right in front of a beaver lodge. So this heron visits here a lot, and boom, fish. Fish love that habitat of an underwater food cache of a beaver lodge, in front of a beaver lodge, and around a beaver lodge, around a beaver dam, upstream, downstream. Fish love it. Herons love fish. What is this guy? Pacific martin, or pine martin. Oh, it's better known as American martin, also known as. This guy's fishing in winter. It looks like it's frozen over ice, but we caught this cute little critter in about 20 pictures, diving multiple times into the water, and finally came up with a fish. And this, again, is the same place the heron was, different season. And if you notice real close, there's a heron in the upper left-hand corner of this photo, waiting for their turn for fishing. Black bears love beaver ponds. Black bears actually need water to cool off in the hottest parts of the year. They can't self-regulate when it's that hot, especially during the heat dome this year, which most of us were pretty shocked at. It got up to 115 in the north central Washington in the Methow River watershed. A lot of other places got much hotter. I know, I'm pretty sure down in your neck of the woods, it got quite a bit hotter than that. Predators love all the aquatic resources around a beaver pond and terrestrial ones, like deer, like beavers. We've got more martins, skunk, raccoons, coyotes. It is an amazing place for all life that needs water, and that's more than 80% of terrestrial and all of aquatic life that require water at some point in their life cycle, if not all of it. Beavers are pretty amazing at supplying the requisite things for life. Let's talk a little bit more about beavers specifically. Not everybody knows all the amazing things about beavers. Castor canadensis is the Latin name. There are 2 species of beaver on this beautiful planet that evolved from a very large mega beaver, Castoroides, but we'll get a little view of that one later. Castor canadensis is our beaver in North America. Castor fiber is generally Europe and Asia. Though the two have mixed a little bit because of trying to restore beaver populations in different parts of the world. Sometimes Castor canadensis was taken over to Europe. Both Castor canadensis and Castor fiber were taken down to South America, not their native habitat. So there's been some mixing over the last century plus. And here's Castoroides, at least a skeletal remains of one. They were about the size of a black bear and evolved in North America. And this was over 8 million years ago. Beavers have been around a long time in their current form, and they're pretty amazing. The Castoroides did not build dams. They did burrow, more like a regular rodent does, and so do beavers. That's one of their beautiful things about creating complexity in aquatic habitats, that they burrow. They are strict herbivores. There's a lot of confusion around beavers eating fish. They are not predators of fish. They are not meat eaters. They are strict herbivores. They are choosy herbivores. Yes, they do like some vegetation better than others, but they primarily are eating herbs and forbs in the summertime, though they do cut trees down in the summertime too, and eat the bark and cambium of those shrubs and trees. But especially in cold climates, like up here in north central Washington, they cut a lot of deciduous trees down for winter use. It gets quite cold, a little harder to move around in the deep snow, though they do not hibernate. They will come out in the deep snow, and often come springtime, we will find beaver chewed trees with the stumps as tall as my head. And sometimes when people are new around here, they'll be like, well, that's the mega beaver, the Castoroides, who's out and about around here. But they were really standing on 2 to 3 feet of snow, and got to cut it down a little higher than normal, come back and eat the rest later on come summertime. So again, I talked about choosy generalists. There's a few favorites of beavers, of course, in different parts of the world. They have their favorites, but willow, cottonwood, aspen are some of their all-time favorites. But they do love treats too. Apples, and they can survive without deciduous trees around as well. Pond lilies, not just the actual tubers, which help sustain them in the winter time and can completely sustain them, but also the leaves of pond lilies. They'll actually roll them up like a little burrito and gnaw on them like a burrito as well. They're amazing, choosy generalists. They do live up to 15 years, though there's a lot of pressure on them in our current modern landscape. And they generally are monogamous and mate for life. If they lose a mate, they do go looking for another. But but they're a lot like us in a lot of ways, that they care for one another, especially their offspring. They have 2 to 5 kids per year. Those kids become reproductively mature at about 2 years of age, though it can vary, especially if there's not a lot of beavers around, they might mature earlier. If there are a lot of beavers around, they might mature later. And beavers invest a lot of time and energy in their young. They spend 2 years training them. They have their first year kids help train their new kids, and they stick around, and they often only move a little bit downstream to start a new family. The offspring do. Some move a little further than others, but that's the beautiful way that beavers disperse and potentially help restore streams, is that they gradually disperse from an area of good habitat into an area of more marginal habitat and fix it up. So teeth, amazing. It's part of why they do the amazing engineering work they do, is those incisors. They're orange. And a lot of you might know this already, but orange teeth, what else is orange in the natural environment, especially minerals? Iron. The beavers actually have quite a bit of iron in their system, and it comes out in their teeth very specifically. It's amazing adaptation that on the front side is iron, on the back side is softer enamel. They have a natural auto sharpening tooth. So the backside wears faster, the front side stays strong, keeps it sharp enough to be gnawing trees down. So it's a pretty tough job to gnaw a tree down. I have a hard enough time cutting it with a saw. So another amazing adaptation for beavers is they have an innate ability to build dams. It's been tested. Beavers that have never built a dam, were never shown how to build a dam, play the sound of running water, and beavers will try to build a dam to stop that water. It's one of the ways we can actually coexist with them really well, is understanding what stimulates them and trying to work with that stimulation instead of against it. Get more of that later. So again, they're building habitat. They don't just build dams, they also excavate. That increases the complexity of habitat tremendously by making holes in riverbanks and etc. They also build lodges, some a little fancier than others, some in the middle of water, some on banks. But why do they build lodges? Why do they build them in the middle of water? It's primarily for protection, to avoid predation. Another major factor in them being semi-aquatic mammals are these great features of webbed feet that they've evolved over time. They have a second set of lips that they can carry vegetation underwater without swallowing a bunch of water, so it closes off the back of their mouth. They have a nictitating membrane over their eyelids, a second eyelid to swim with their eyes open underwater. And then they can hold their breath for 15 plus minutes. That's generally used to avoid predation and hide. But the key thing about beavers, one of the key things about getting them back on our landscape, is having the deep enough water to evade predation. And that tail is amazing. It can be used as a rudder when they're cutting a tree down, or a kickstand, excuse me, when they're cutting a tree down, or a rudder when they're swimming, turn fast, sharp. Can also be used as an alarm call. Most of us know that sharp flap on the water that startles the heck out of you when you're out having a peaceful time by a beaver pond. But why aren't they around? Why aren't they doing more on the landscape if they're so good at storing water and creating habitat that supports incredible biodiversity? Most of us know this story too. They're nearly extirpated by the late 1800s, really more around the mid 1800s. And primarily that was initially for hats in Europe. All the rage, everybody had to have one, and it had to be beaver. They felted really well. They made really nice top hats. But in Europe, they ran out of them. They came over to North America. And when they did, the political battles that ensued following that were tremendous. If you want to know more about that, I could talk for hours just about that issue of losing beavers from North America. You can read Once They Were Hats, Eager, amazing books, and a great film, The Beaver Believers. Check that out. There's so much more interesting history around beavers than most of us were aware of before you became obsessed with beavers, like me. So just to take us back again, the ecological amnesia, us not understanding what our landscape looked like prior to settlement, is one of the troubles we have of getting beavers back on a landscape that we're not used to seeing them on. Historically, beavers were probably 3 to 10 per stream kilometer. That's a lot of beavers across North America. Currently, I think we're only around 15 million, but there hasn't been a population study of beavers across North America ever. The 15 million that so many people quote, you'll see it in Eager, Ben Goldfarb's book, that was an estimate of an early expedition leader who said, after all the beavers have been trapped out, we think there might be 15 million left in North America. We're ready for another population study of beavers. But there's so few on the landscape now. We really need to think about how we can coexist with them, since we have occupied most of their habitat now that they once occupied. Same places, we are competing for that same habitat along freshwater systems where resources are generally rich. But there's a reason that beavers just haven't repopulated our landscape and our watersheds, because a lot of our use of the landscape, converting our landscapes for our needs, for agriculture, for timber harvest, for residential and commercial environments, has left our river systems in pretty poor shape. Livestock grazing in the West, that's a big impact on our stream systems. So without beavers on the landscape, not a lot of our streams can support beavers even. But what I do want to talk about before I go into how we restore these streams is what beavers are actually doing when they are existing in these streams, because they are in places and they're doing amazing work. And they're storing water, as we talked about earlier. They're slowing down sediment that comes out of the mountains and down to the larger river systems like the Columbia. And they're storing carbon, primarily deep in the sediments that settle into the bottom of a beaver pond, as well as holding wood that is slowing the degradation process of carboniferous materials. So beavers ponds are an incredible place to store carbon long-term. Carbon, as most of you know, released to the atmosphere, contributing to greenhouse gases and the ultimate warming of our climate. Beavers can help keep that carbon in the ground and underwater. There's also floodplain connectivity, which helps create nutrient exchange between terrestrial and aquatic environments. And it also captures excess nutrients as they come downstream, whether that's from municipal environments or agricultural environments, livestock, row crops. A lot of the high nutrient that ends up flowing on surface waters where agriculture is happening can cause some major problems downstream. Algal blooms, that's becoming a huge problem across the globe from nutrients from our landscape and our human activities moving downstream. And algal blooms happen in freshwater systems and they happen in saltwater systems. So beavers help store those nutrients with the carbon in the sediments underwater where they stay put most of the time. When you have redundant beaver dams on a landscape, they don't blow out as easily as a single beaver dam on a landscape. So that's going to come up again when we talk about restoration. When we have redundancy, we have resilience within our streams across our watersheds. The redundant structure, beaver dams represent structure, but other things can too. We'll get to that in a little bit. And with that structure and with beaver activity comes increased habitat complexity, which leads to increased quality for a lot of the species that depend on freshwater systems. And our salmonids at different life stages can depend on these areas absolutely conditionally. You know, juvenile salmon require slow water environments to rear, not only in summer, but often in winter. For different salmon species, they require different environments for their life cycles. But juvenile salmon of pretty much all species benefit from beaver complexes. There are even some adult species like coho who really benefit as spawners at that stage of their life cycle. But it's the complexity of these habitats that really makes the difference for our salmon species, as well as many of the other species that salmon depend on, but also that depend on salmon. This is just an example of the complexity of depth of water, just that one variable, depth of water. In a beaver system on the right, that dark blue color represents the deepest part of that stream where beavers are, and light blue the shallowest. So you can see alone that there's quite a bit of dark blue in the beavered complex. On the left, the non-beavered, it's mostly light blue with a few places where there's dark, or at a bend where there's scouring in that stream system. So just wanted to throw that out. There's a lot of scientific research behind stream restoration through beaver relocation and improvements that will attract beaver. So this is an example of that, building the biodiversity and refugia. Refugia meaning basically safe havens for species, especially ones that rely on freshwater systems. And a lot of those species are becoming more and more endangered. Some in particular are spring chinook and steelhead species, and some of the freshwater species that rely on cold, clean water that they feed on. A lot of the macroinvertebrates that salmon rely on the same conditions to survive. So salmon's resources, their food web, relies on the same water quality and habitat complexity that salmon do. Columbia spotted frogs and a lot of amphibians thrive in these freshwater wetlands. Townsend's big-eared bats, we have done studies up here in the Methow where we showed 400 times greater use of beaver pond areas for feeding than non-beavered areas for bats. And we did that through sonar detection. And western pond turtles, which is a great species down in the Columbia neck of the woods, but disappearing fast because wetlands have disappeared so quickly. Beavers help. They create more wetlands with what they do. And Columbian sharp-tailed grouse, not too many people associate this endangered species with beaver, but the winter habitat that sharp-tailed grouse rely on is water birch. And water birch grows in riparian systems and grows better in a beaver riparian system because there's more water and more landscape covered by water. Another benefit of beavers, they're also creating resilience on the landscape to drought, to floods, to wildfire, and general climate change, heat domes, etc., simply by having more water on the landscape. Water doesn't burn. It helps avoid larger scale drought impacts when you have a lot of water on the landscape. And it actually helps slow flooding down by creating speed bumps across the landscape with those dams and with large surface water bodies. It captures that pulse of water and pushes it out on the landscape again. So it can even address flooding issues. So the Beaver Project, the whole goal of our project has been to store more water on the landscape. We have now expanded our mission in the last few years to actually really restore degraded streams with structure on our own first, and then reintroduce beavers to those landscapes, because a lot of our streams are so degraded, especially after wildfire. Beavers can't get a foothold, not easily at all. We have 15 years of experience of relocating them to prove it, but yeah, we're helping them out now. And I'm not going to spend too much time on how we've developed our relocation project, but if anybody wants to know more information, Jeanette and I are talking all the time about building up Wishpush's relocation project. So it's going to be happening more and more down in your neck of the woods. This is just examples of some of the habitat relocating beavers has built on our North Cascades upper headwater habitat in our watersheds. So it's successful. It can be very successful, but you need all the things in place that beavers need. And primarily that's deep water and deciduous food resources. So if those aren't available, you're going to have a hard time getting beavers to stick and then expand upon that establishment. So we really focus a lot on education and outreach. We have a ton of tools and resources. If anybody wants them, get a hold of me. We work with academic universities. We're constantly looking at proving efficacy of beaver-mediated stream restoration. We study all aspects of it: sediment movement, nutrient movement, diversity of wildlife, water residency times, water quality, both temperature as well as dissolved oxygen. We love to partner with academics. We like to do a lot of fun stuff with folks to help them learn about beavers. We get them involved doing projects out in the field, lots of students, but and the general public for sure. We do a lot of singing about the environment, which is really fun. It's called edutainment. I recommend you take advantage of any opportunity to participate in edutainment. We've had a great time. A lot of you folks might have gone to or know folks from Whitman College in Walla Walla. We host the Westies every fall for a big work party and education opportunity. We like to do that with other groups too. We got a group from Utah this for past fall. But let's talk about some of the challenges of relocation. Habitat degradation. That is one of the biggest ones we have. Coexistence, of course, is another, but we'll get to that. Habitat degradation was already there from a lot of the human activities that occurred over the last 100+ years. Timber harvest, mining, livestock raising, habitat encroachment, land conversion for agriculture, all amazing human things that we've done. We came to this land that seemed endless with so much resources ready and available, but it wasn't endless, and it isn't. And right now we are encroaching on, I'm just gonna keep moving on. We're just at the point where we can't naturally and easily get beavers back on the landscape without doing some work to prep it for them. So this is following wildfires. One of my biggest focuses is how do we restore streams that have been severely degraded by wildfire and the post-wildfire debris flows that have followed in many of our streams across the Methow and Okanagan watersheds from precipitation events that followed right on top of a burned landscape. A recently burned landscape. So this is 2 systems out of so many that were severely degraded. This is channelization on a scale of anywhere from 3 feet to 2 to 3 meters in some of our streams, large streams as well as small. Another challenge to beaver relocation and establishment, that high predation. We've got a lot of predators on the landscape, which is fantastic, but we don't have a lot of deep water to help beavers avoid predation. So we got to work on that. We need to get more hidey holes for beavers out on our landscape. It's like here, one of our beaver complexes, we got a lot of predator pressure, but the beavers have deep water and broad water. They're still there. There's no evidence that any predators have taken the beavers from this specific location where we've worked with them for more than 3 years now. What we do have evidence of is legal trapping. I don't know how many of you all know this, but it is legal to trap beavers as a fur bearer for 5 months of the year with no limit to the number of beavers you can take. I'm not opposed to trapping for recreational use, for traditional and cultural, and our project isn't. We work with trappers. We like to know where they're seeing beavers, where they're not seeing beavers, how many they may be taking, because that's really hard to gauge from the state regulations and requirements for recording and reporting harvest. But really 5 months of the year with unlimited harvest for a species that we regularly partner with for restoration with state agencies and federal agencies, that's a conflict of interest. And it's a big challenge. We don't have any idea how many beavers private landowners take just because of the conflict or nuisance that they've created. And there's no rule that they have to report that at all. So there's a lot we don't know about how beavers are being harvested on our landscape. And we don't know how many beavers there are within our watersheds. There's no protections for beavers who are being partnered with for restoration. We relocate beavers with grant funding. If it's in a public place or a private place, they can be harvested at least 5 months of the year in a public place at no limit. So those are challenges we're facing that we want to approach through bridge building and not through division. So I just mentioned these things because it's going to be coming up more and more across our state. Our state is one of the most progressive beaver management states in the US and even Canada. So it's something we're going to have to work on if we want to partner with beavers on a larger scale. Because trapping is actually gaining in popularity. It was falling for more than 2 decades, fewer and fewer people applying for harvest permits. But the last 2 years with COVID, it has seen a spike, and there are a lot of people putting pressure on a very small beaver population, at least up in our neck of the woods. And again, beaver populations vary across the state and across the West and North America. But in arid and semi-arid environments, there are generally fewer beavers. It's harder to make a living here, especially in the cold environment, but it's not as wet. Beavers need water. So does much of the rest of the living community. So we've worked with WDFW on putting suggested restrictions out in some of our beaver relocation sites on public lands. So far, they are not preventing legal trapping, but it's a start. We've at least got our land managers working with us and recognizing that there is a challenge here and a conflict of interest. And so we're working on it. We're building bridges. But we have a lot more bridges to build. We need a population study to better understand our beavers and how we might protect the ones that we're really working with. And we need to shift our perspective and our paradigm to look at valuing beavers through management as a critical partner in restoration of watershed processes, habitat, and adapting to a changing climate, and recognizing them as a keystone species, one that supports so much more life than just themselves. How can we do that? Well, coexistence is one of them. Beavers can cause a lot of challenge on the landscape because they're competing with us now for habitat. We've built a lot of infrastructure in the habitat that beavers once occupied. There's even competing restoration goals around which species should take priority. And of course, endangered species need to take priority, but beavers can actually support endangered species much better than a lot of people recognize because they just haven't been on the landscape for so long. So there's so much more detail to that, but if anybody's interested in more after this talk, feel free to get a hold of me or at Underwood Conservation District, Wishpush, Mid-Columbia Fisheries. There's so much information to gain on that front. So what I'm trying to say is we really need to reconnect with our understanding of natural processes and beavers as a huge player in promoting natural processes in our watersheds. So you might recognize this beautiful lady, Jeanette. She's up in Yukon Territories up here after an awesome trip through many beautiful watersheds. I hope I get to do that someday. So we have a ton of tools for coexistence now. It's growing rapidly. The last 20 years have seen incredible change and creativity and experimentation with how do we live with beavers, keeping them on the landscape, but preventing them from damaging infrastructure, but allowing them to create the ecological benefit. So if you want to know more about this, culvert protectors, of course, caging trees, that's easy, but it takes time. Surface water elevation control, flow devices, amazingly effective if applied properly. Every context, every stream is different. Every application is different. You need someone who's been trained in these strategies to do it right. Otherwise, it's going to get a bad name. If we're doing it wrong and they're failing, they get a bad name. Do it right, apply it appropriately to the context, maintain it, adaptively manage it. We're going to have a lot more beavers around until we can solve some of the larger landscape issues around land conversion, simplification of our watersheds, homes in floodplains, communities in floodplains. Until we get to some of these bigger solutions, these are good short-term solutions to keep beavers on the landscape, help them disperse, help them grow their populations by learning to coexist with them. These are some of the groups up in my neck of the woods who are helping fund coexistence right now. Our conservation district, Okanagan Conservation District, their voluntary stewardship program, Salmon Recovery Funding Board, USDA APHIS program has been a wonderful supporter, providing us materials for coexistence and non-lethal management of beavers. Defenders of Wildlife and a local group, Methow Valley Fund, and lots of private donors have been stepping up to help us help others coexist and not bear the brunt alone of working with challenging beavers in their front yard, backyard, flooding their roads. If we want a community benefit from beavers, We need to help people who are directly impacted by the challenges of beavers coexist with them more easily. Golf courses. This is we just did this one last year. Such an easy fix to the flooding they were having on some of their greens. And it costs less than $1,500. It is easy to maintain. They're so happy with it. It was, yeah, they've been struggling with beavers for years and years, though they appreciate them. They didn't want them lethally removed. We have relocated from this location multiple times, but beavers always find it. It's a good wetland habitat. And that's a good argument for coexistence. Even when you relocate from places, if it's good habitat, beavers will find it again. So coexistence, let them stay there, but reduce the challenges with coexistence strategy. So here's another one where we put in a surface water control device in a salmon restoration stream. It's working beautifully. Fish are using it. They're as juvenile and winter rearing habitat, which is in very short supply in our watershed. And it's also spawning habitat for coho. It's a long side channel, off channel habitat of the Methow River. So we're having incredible success with this one. Still experimental, but it's been 3 years now. We're going on our 3rd year. And this is one of the greatest pictures we've gotten from some of our trail cams. Beavers with 2 coho, or a beaver with 2 coho swimming underneath it with part of our flow device in the background, that round cage that's protecting the inlet of the flow device. We're also studying all of this all the time with as much funding as we can apply to monitoring and reporting. We're doing snorkel surveys, water quality monitoring. We're putting microarrays to make sure salmon are able to travel through our flow devices. And so far, we're just seeing wonderful results. The year before we put a flow device in one of our coexistence projects that allowed beavers to stay in the area, there were no juvenile salmon in that backwater channel. We lowered the dam, we controlled surface water, kept the dam there. The next year, high flows allowed juvenile salmon to come into the system over the dams, backwatering. We had thousands of coho and Chinook, spring Chinook in there. And they were able to leave because of our flow device. So far we're seeing great success in changing the landscape from one of primarily degraded streams in many of our watersheds through restoration and coexistence. So I'm gonna let Jeanette talk more about restoration with structure, really breaking it down for everybody, but turning channelized streams back into beaver complexes is the goal there. Here's just an example of some of the upper headwater systems, historic beaver habitat that hasn't seen a beaver in decades, maybe nearly a century. A lot of these places are livestock grazing areas. Coming in here to these historic dams that have breaches in them, circled in red, where livestock have generally just trampled the area they're trying to get to water. There's a tiny bit of water trickling through here and the livestock are attracted to it. We came in, we built a little, we fixed the hole in the dam, you know, that classic story. We put a finger in the hole in the dam, and literally overnight, and then weeks later, we have surface water being held back by a historic beaver dam that's not maintained by beavers. We've just plugged up the hole. So there's an example of restoration with structure without beavers. But hopefully it will support beavers in the future. We're helping prep that meadow again to support beavers, where it's mostly conifers right now, encroaching in on it that would not support beavers. Wood placement in streams after fires. There's a lot of dead wood, a lot of downed wood after fires along many of our streams. And a lot of them have been incised so deeply that the wood just spans right across the incised channel. We're helping to push that wood back into these incised streams, make contact with the water, slow it down, start creating those inset floodplains, bouncing water back and forth, making it more sinuous, more complex, turning into something more like this, where streams connect with their floodplains at high flows. It's an incredible project up in northern Washington called the Triple Creek Project. I'm just going to jump through here, putting structure in streams, in severely degraded streams. Looking at this alder here, structures went in, widened the stream, and then beavers followed up behind. This is just a little triptych that I love showing people from this project. 4 years, and you have incredible aggradation and raising the substrate of that inside stream back up and reconnecting it to its floodplain. We're doing the same in the anadromous zone, but not with channel spanning structure, just with bank anchored structures called PALs. We're using fire thinned forest wood for the materials for our structures. So we're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. We're reducing fire risk and building structure in channelized streams. This is an old irrigation diversion, armored, so water would only go straight where folks wanted it back in the day. We added structure in that same bank anchored structure system, pushed water the first high flow the next year, pushed water across the floodplain, reconnected, created, that's the channel where the blue line is, created pool systems throughout that armored channel, and then pushed water, which supported spawning coho, then pushed water across that floodplain in so many different places. And it lasted for 6 weeks, where it never even connected prior to this, not since that diversion went in. So supporting a lot of juvenile salmon in that refugia, slow water hydraulic refugia area. And then fire. I mean, fire is such a big part of our landscape. It used to be, and it's coming back because we've kept it away and suppressed it for so long. But beavers can make a huge difference after this wildfire impact. That was a huge part of my study, is when we can get beavers back in a system, they do support critical habitat building where it makes sense, where they can get a foothold. So I'm kind of jumping through fast because I've been talking a long time, but what are beavers doing on the landscape? They are supporting biodiversity, trumpeter swans, which used to be endangered and are now coming back. They love beaver ponds. They rely on them for protection. These are steelhead parr that are getting ready to leave a beaver complex that we put a coexistence device in, heading to the ocean that spring. They are doing really well. Beavers help build resilience through disturbance like wildfire and drought. We're going to see this video in just a second. I can't get it to play through mine, so we'll skip that one for right now. But here's an area that fire came through 2 years ago. There was a beaver complex. It was the only green place in the entire 400,000 acres practically that burned, where there were beavers. This is one of them. It was full of waterfowl, songbirds, rabbits, coyotes, deer when I visited and took that photo. This is what it looks like downstream of that beaver wetland after the fire, where there were no beavers. So dramatic, and that's unfortunately the primary condition of our landscape, is more like that picture. So this is after 2014 Carlton Complex fires. We put beavers in this stream in 2018, and beavers started building dams right away, storing thousands of gallons of water in what was a debris flow damaged stream after fire. So we're doing this across our landscape. This is actually last year during the Cub Creek and Cedar Creek fires up here. What you see in the foreground is a beaver complex that's built up since the 2014 Carlton Complex fires. We reintroduced beavers in 2015 in this site. It took a few years, but they are now repairing the severe incision up to 3 meters in some places. And what I wanted, this picture is so indicative of like, okay, well now across the valley, we're gonna be moving over there to do some work with structure restoration and beavers. So I'm going to end this with my call to action, which you're going to see again at the end of this to help everybody remember. Share what you know, what you've learned about beavers and landscape and watershed processes, why we need beavers, and how we could benefit by partnering with them on a larger scale. Consider the benefits of coexistence before you remove beavers from your property or talk to someone who's having beaver challenges. Learn more about coexistence. There's so many more options now. Learn more and advocate for modernizing the management of beavers in our state or in Oregon, elsewhere. Find a beaver pond and just enjoy it and observe and learn more about them and all the critters that rely on them, and volunteer with your local restoration organization. There's a lot of them there that are working together to make good things happen. And then ultimately, take the time out of every day to enjoy and appreciate the beauty and wonder of this place, because that's what inspires us to make change happen. So thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for listening. There's so much to this story. It's hard to just gloss over so many critical aspects, but I wanted to make sure we got a broader view. So thanks, everybody. I think we're going to watch the video now of Emily Fairfax, Dr. Emily Fairfax, who's done amazing work with beavers and wildfire resilience on the landscape. So enjoy this. It's a real crowd pleaser.
All right, thanks, Jan, for putting that up there. And thank you, Alexa, for such a fascinating presentation. I think we all learned something. I think we're gonna hold off on questions just to get through our major content for now. We have a couple more people to speak. And so if you can hang on to your question, we definitely will get to you toward the end. So thanks again. And I'm getting ready to share my screen now for Jeanette, who's going to go ahead and talk next.
Thanks, Tova, and thank you so much, Alexa. I feel like every time you open your mouth, I learn things. I just want to put a shout out to Alexa and the Methow Beaver Project for all her generous support of fledgling organizations like the Wish Push Working Group and other small groups that are kind of trying to get our bearings with working in the beaver sphere. She's been incredibly generous with her time and her knowledge and support and mentoring. So she really is a stalwart of the whole beaver movement in at least Washington State, but probably far beyond that. So I feel really lucky that we have her here and she's willing to help. So, and it's always really inspiring to see all the work that you're doing up in the Methow. So you're a tough act to follow, and I'll chat a little bit about the little bit that I know, but I just wanted to basically scratch the surface a little bit on what is going on in our area down here that I know of. And there's probably quite a bit more. So feel free, other presenters or other even participants, when we're done talking, please chime in and let me know about things that I may have forgotten or don't know about here. But I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the efforts, both here in our area and statewide. So there are quite a few, or at least several beaver working groups that are, multi-stakeholder groups trying to work on getting beavers back onto the landscape, beaver-based restoration. And there's a Washington State beaver working group, the Gifford-Pinchot. The Forest Service has also convened a Gifford-Pinchot beaver working group. So there are movements afoot just in terms of trying to get more coordinated between different agencies and organizations interested in doing this work. Within our program, within the Yakama Nation, the wildlife program has been doing beaver trapping and relocation for a number of years now. The fisheries program is building up its capacity to do that work up in the Yakama Valley. as well as obviously down here in our area, all the way up to the Matau. The Tulalip tribe has really been spearheading beaver relocation and reintroductions up in their neck of the woods, and have really been a model for a lot of other tribes and organizations that want to do this work. The Cowlitz tribe has been doing a tremendous amount of relocations and restoration in their areas as well. Great program. We also have Cascade Forest Conservancy, a number of these other organizations that you see listed there. So lots of folks that are doing either helping with coexistence with beavers, doing restoration work or relocations, or all of the above. I wanted to mention the Beaver Coalition. That's an Oregon and Washington based organization that has put out a beaver restoration guidebook, which can help practitioners. And I believe they're coming out with a new version of that fairly soon. There's great information in there and great guidance. There's actually a beaver conference, for those of you who didn't know that. That's, I think it used to be just national, but now it's become international. So that's both for beaver enthusiasts and practitioners. That's, I believe, back east usually. And then there are efforts going on for everywhere from, the west to the east coast with trying to bring beavers back or to keep them on the landscape for all of their benefits. As Alexa mentioned, there is quite a bit going on in Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well, all the way into Asia. Some of the restoration reintroduction efforts go all the way back like hundreds of years, because some of these countries wiped out their beaver populations centuries before we did, or close to it, and they're building back up. So that's exciting, including in the UK, as Alexa mentioned. In some places, beavers are being used or looked to as a way to prevent catastrophic flooding or to lessen the effects of flooding. And that's the case in the UK. I did want to briefly mention that Defenders of Wildlife, one of the organizations that Alexa mentioned, has a crowdsource app to collect information about where people are seeing beavers. So that's kind of a community science smartphone app that you can use, and it protects beaver locations to some degree because it's fairly coarse scale, but it does help all of us who would like to know more about what beaver populations are to try and collect some of that data from the community. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I forgot also to put on here, but Mid-Columbia Fisheries has been doing beaver work up in the Yakima Basin and in their more northern ranges for a while now as well. So they're certainly experienced in this arena. And I did want to mention that WDFW, as Alexa alluded to, they are both managing recreational trapping as well as they have a beaver relocation pilot program. So they're trying to come up with sort of a systematic approach to training people in how to trap and relocate beavers. So I think that's it for that. That slide. I just wanted to mention to you that as Alexa mentioned, there are lots of challenges with regulatory pieces of this. So in Oregon, I believe beavers are still classified as predators. In California, I think they're considered a detrimental species. So Washington really is, we're kind of at the forefront in some ways of really encouraging a different way of looking at beavers. So the Wish-Push Working Group that we're involved with, as Margaret mentioned, we've been trying to collect as much information as possible about beaver populations in this area and have been talking to people and agencies and going out on the ground and ground truthing. And we have learned some things just in the course of the last few years of being active, in that we actually don't know much about beaver populations. As Alexa said, there's a dearth of really good data about how many beavers are out there. And from what we've seen, populations seem pretty low. There's a lot of historic or prehistoric beaver habitat that seems to be unoccupied for one reason or another. And that, you know, there may be lots of different causes for that, as Alexa mentioned. And we're still trying to wrap our hands around what local beaver populations might be. Also, beavers may surprise you. We have been finding them in places where we really wouldn't expect to find them. And they may not be in places where we would expect to find them. So it's pretty interesting to see the range of where they choose to take up residence and how adaptable they are to conditions that seem not that optimal for them. We've also been finding them in a lot of human infrastructure, including irrigation, which is attractive to them because it's obviously moving water and there's often some streamside vegetation along it, or I guess ditch side. And so that is a challenge for coexistence that we are trying to also figure out ways to help landowners and land managers work with. And I just want to make a note about this location that you see in the photo there. This is an industrial site that is managed by the Columbia River Treaty Tribes down close to the Columbia River that beavers moved into. This is a constructed pond that's fed by some springs off the hillside, and the beavers have plugged up the outlet and it raised the level of the pond and it was overflowing. And then they mowed down a bunch of the trees around that pond for both food and building materials. And so this is a site where we're working with the managers of the site to come up with solutions to how to allow the beavers to do their thing, but also not cause damage to infrastructure or human hazards. Next, please. So Alexa showed this slide, and I really like this because it takes a very complex concept and simplifies it. You can see this single thread channel stream that is downcut, as some of the photos that she showed. There's not a lot of complexity, not a lot of vegetation. The water table is really low. And then you can start putting in structure where the structure isn't available on its own by nature or because of land use or other impacts. You can place structure the way beavers would, and it starts having these effects of spreading the water out, slowing it down, grading sediment, forcing the water into the hyporheic zone, which raises the water table. And pretty soon you have a whole different landscape there, as you see on the right-hand side. So it's kind of a continuum from the left to the right. And it also, I wanted to put a plug in for the importance of these headwater meadows represented kind of by the image on the right. These are not only biodiversity hotspots, but also for a lot of important cultural uses and resources for tribes. Meadows are incredibly important as a hotspot for first foods. And so there's a huge need to rebuild some of these historic meadow areas for a lot of different benefits, but including cultural, and for the importance to increasing resiliency to climate change impacts. Next, please. So one of the ways that you can increase the habitat quality and quantity and water storage in some of these degraded streams in the West that have not had the benefits of beavers, or where the beavers have moved on, is something that's been termed low-tech process-based restoration. And what you're basically doing is adding simple, low-cost structural elements like wood, like beaver dams or beaver mimicry, to basically mimic what beavers do to promote and sustain natural beaver processes. So a lot of times these kind of structures are hand-built. They're made out of natural materials like posts and slash. They're meant to not last forever. And it's meant to be sort of iterative and able to scale to different sizes. And you're essentially letting the system do the work. So you're letting the stream power and or beavers take care of that and maintain that structure for you over time and create pools and complexity and diversity in that habitat. So that's it in a nutshell. It's also been called beaver process-based restoration. So you might hear either one of those. Next, please. This is just basically two of the main processes that are involved. So on the top, you can see something that's called a post-assisted log structure, which I think you saw some photos of that before too, where people will pound in posts and weave some woody material through it. And that in turn accumulates wood and forces water out and down. And then down below, a beaver dam analog. So you're imitating what beavers will do naturally. And sometimes beavers actually come in and build on that. So in that photo, beavers have actually taken interest and said, yes, I'm gonna help these folks out and build up this beaver dam. Next, please. So just so you all have an idea of a few of the low-tech process-based projects that we have going on in the Klickitat Basin. This is a map showing the locations of some of the projects that we have initiated or are planning in the next little while. So the top number 1 through 4 are kind of in the headwater area of the Klickitat Basin, and then the other 6 through 9 are in the White Creek watershed, which is responsible for about 40% of the steelhead, mid-Columbia steelhead spawning in the basin. And some of those are in Teepee Creek. And we have, degraded streams due to historic and to some degree more recent land use. So there is work that can be done there without massive intervention. So we're seeing what we can do with these low-tech process-based interventions there. Next, please. So these sites that we are selecting are basically places where there are wider valley bottoms. The stream velocities are lower. The area is less steep. There's less gradient. There's an active floodplain that is quite a bit narrower than probably what the potential is or what it historically was. In this case, you can see this is in the upper Klickitat. There's kind of a single thread channel, and the channel is preventing water from accessing the floodplain. It's downcut, it's simplified. There's not a lot of vegetation around the sides of the channel. So there is some opportunity there to do to increase the complexity by putting in some structure and forcing the water out onto the floodplain. If you look closely, you can see there are kind of some traces of relic channels out on that floodplain, but they aren't getting engaged very much anymore. So this is a place where beavers probably used to have a really messy, complex kind of a wetland area, and for whatever reason they're not there, and we need to help encourage them or similar activities to help bring function back to this spot. Next, please. This is another spot. This is Teepee Creek, where you can see that the channel is sort of shoved up against the left-hand side, and there's what looks to be a former floodplain off to the right where the water doesn't seem to be activating very much anymore. This is another place where there are reduced wood accumulations, like large wood jams. There's not much wood in that creek to spread the water out. The diversity, like the pool and off-channel habitat, is not there. There's not very much connectivity with the floodplain or riparian vegetation. So that's another good candidate for low-tech process-based restoration. Next, please. And this last example, I don't know if any of you would be able to recognize this from an aerial view, but the sort of canyon that you see in the upper part of the photo is the Little Klickitat, and the sort of backwards S snaking creek that is flowing into it is Blockhouse Creek. And this is a location where we're working with a private landowner to try and bring some complexity back into the reach of creek, where they said there used to be beavers. Beavers are not there anymore. The riparian area is simplified. The in-channel habitat is simplified and not very conducive to good fish habitat. So another place where in-stream structure can be put in to scour pools, to aggrade sediment, and so on. So this is a spot where there may be some beavers in the neighborhood still. There were certainly historically, and we hear stories about there being some in the area, but certainly getting that stream back to where it could support beaver will be a step in the right direction. And this is also a really important stream because the Little Klickitat River has temperature and flow limitations. It's actually listed as a water body that has impaired water quality. And so this particular stream that feeds it contributes very important flow during the low flow period of the summer. So if you can hold some of that water back and let it release during those really critical low flow periods, that's a huge win. Next, please. And I don't want to leave out, as a key component of low-tech process-based restoration, a sort of complement to that is revegetation. Obviously, vegetation is a hugely important component of both riparian and in-stream health and structure. There's that three-legged stool definitely is a good picture for this too. Beavers also have habitat needs around plants. So as Alexa mentioned, their favorite building materials are also some of their preferred foods. And so where you can provide them with some of those woody deciduous species like cottonwood, aspen, willow, alder, that certainly helps make that habitat more supportive for them. It also provides a lot of other benefits for a range of different species and functions for that riparian and in-stream area. It's an important component of repairing river processes and helping sites become suitable for beavers. So in some cases, it's something that you need to do in order to bring beavers back in, or it's just a good practice in and of itself. Just as an aside, some work was done in the Oregon high desert and that found that approximately 6 to 12 acres of vegetation is needed for a new colony of beavers to become established for a year and a half. So that's really kind of a massive amount of vegetation if you think about it. Next, please. So I'm going to just briefly talk about a future opportunity that we're having a look at, and Alexa touched on this, and that's using beavers or beaver-based restoration to recover watersheds after wildfire. This is a photo from the Upper Klickitat of a large meadow complex that used to have beavers that maintained it and kept this whole valley bottom irrigated, for lack of a better word, and functional. And in the Cougar Creek fire in 2015, this burned really hot and severely. And there's no beavers there currently, and we're seeing the effects of their absence, and the streams are starting to incise. The vegetation is having a really hard time recovering. The arrow that you see there is a historic beaver dam that went nearly across the whole floodplain down there and held the water back. So we need to, we're looking at the potential for putting in some of this low-tech process-based restoration to kind of jumpstart that recovery process. So this is something where we're having a closer look at. And one of the reasons that we are hopeful that that might work is, if you advance to the next photo, this is a shot from a different area that was affected by a different wildfire. And this was the mile marker 28 fire in 2013, but beavers have moved into this area on their own and are basically backing up the water and creating, they're farming the riparian area for building materials and for food. And this has helped this creek go from very intermittent flows to more perennial flows and more flows during the low flow time of year. So it's inspiring. It happened on its own. This is without any intervention, but it clearly shows that you can recover areas, and that will propagate outward, that recovery. So it's kind of exciting. Next, please. So just a quick note about some of the work that we are hoping to do in terms of coexistence and in-place management. I showed that picture of the facility close to the Columbia River where the beavers had basically built up this pond. There are a couple other examples here where beavers are using areas that are basically human built or human managed due to their proximity to the Columbia River, but they represent small pockets of habitat with a bunch of management constraints. And the beavers can outstrip the food resources in fairly short order. This is an example. This is an Army Corps facility close to the Columbia River where beavers built this wonderful lodge. They started toppling a lot of the few cottonwoods in this arid park and pretty much ran out of food. So this is an area where the land manager would like to tolerate the beavers and is trying to work to figure out how to make it conducive to their being around, but it's certainly a management challenge. So this is one example. Next photo, please. And some of you might recognize this. This is also a constructed wetland down at the Port of Klickitat. I believe at least one of our participants tonight works down there. This is a spot where beavers have been trapped out in the past, but keep returning. So clearly there is an attraction there to that constructed wetland, and lots of management constraints, including having a regulatory wetland that has to maintain a particular water level. So these are the types of things where we're trying to work with land managers to assess and characterize, and then eventually propose some solutions, some management recommendations over the long term to allow the beavers to potentially coexist. And if not, if it becomes a conflict that's intolerable, then we will hopefully have the opportunity to relocate to a place where they can be more successful. And I believe there should be one more photo there. You can, yeah, so that's just a shot of that upper part of the wetlands that shows 2 lodges and a little dam and some foraging channels that the beavers have constructed in this area. So that's one spot. If you're local to the White Salmon Bingen area, you can go and potentially observe some beavers doing their thing. All right, that's it for me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jeanette. That was fascinating. And I think, yeah, that's just amazing how much potential habitat and activity is right here in our backyards under our noses that we could be out there observing. So I'm going to just pick it up briefly. I'm going to review a couple concepts, but really highlight a couple projects that we've done at Underwood Conservation District. And you've heard this before with what Alexa had to say and what Jeanette brought up as well. So obviously, wetlands and pond habitat are just really important features on our landscape. They're important for providing habitat to beaver and a wide variety of other species. And every living thing needs water to survive. So holding that water back on the landscape is really important for the biology. And then it's really important for water quality and water quantity. So again, using beavers or beaver-based restoration and enhancing these wetland complexes, we're supporting whole watershed health and dissipating flood energy. So there's so many benefits again, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's very important. And the streams that we're working in, many of them are flow limited, as well as experiencing very high temperatures in the summers. So when we're talking about other species that rely on that water, including ESA listed salmon and steelhead, the more we can hold back water on the landscape and let that release slowly into the downstream waters where there's fish habitat, it's really significant for that ecosystem. So here you'll see that we have some local sites where the stream has been incised and it's cut down, and this is partly just due to clearing and removal of woody debris and vegetation. A lot of logging was done up to the stream historically, and that structure was removed. And then, as we've heard, beaver were removed as well from many of these meadows where they historically existed. So this location, we've got our colleague Margaret in the pink shirt. We're looking at Simmons Creek, which is a tributary to Snyder Creek, and that flows into the Klickitat River, where we do have ESA listed fish. And yeah, again, you can just see how it's down cut. The old water pipes are already exposed from a cattle trough that used to come out of this creek. And there's just very little holding it together, holding the soil or holding back water. Here's another Grand Canyon epic photo, again with Margaret. And the same stream here is just worse. And there's just, it's just not functioning properly. It's not holding back water. The water table has dropped here in this case at least 10, 12 feet. And that's not going to store the water the way we need to, especially for those low flow summertime seasons. Here is an amazing picture of a cow that actually fell into an incised stream. This is in Upper Rattlesnake Creek, which flows into the White Salmon River. And this cow, unfortunately, found herself in the wrong place and can't get out. She actually has been scratched up by, I believe, coyotes on her back since she was so vulnerable there. So obviously it's a hazard for animals and humans. but this kind of channel incision can cause many problems on many levels. And I really like this graphic because it shows, again, that channel evolution that you saw in some of the other pictures. When we have an incised stream, again, that water table drops, and sometimes this channel evolution results in a widening of that lower floodplain, the lower elevation floodplain. And if we have beavers, or if we can mimic what beavers do, we can start to hold back water and even degrade the channel a little bit and start holding back more sediment. And again, because of the increased amount of water, we have more vegetation being established. And over time, that really can become a beautiful, more complex environment that has real benefits for the habitat, the wildlife, the fish downstream, and overall water holding capacity. So this is a picture of a structure that we built more than 10 years ago. This is on that Simmons Creek stretch that I showed earlier. And the structures that we used to build were not intended to mimic beaver. This is obviously kind of an engineered type of structure using logs, and they're cabled together. And, you know, to be honest, we've evolved from some of these past designs. And while this, in a structural sense, pretty much serves the purpose, these structures do need maintenance and do need to come, you need to either have a beaver there helping to maintain it, or come back and help build and maintain the structure. But it's not really a natural looking feature to the eye, the common viewer here. So yeah, this is an early form of basically a check down that we used to create along these headwater channels. And we used to create these out of, you know, before my time, they were built out of things like hay bales and straw wattles and all kinds of materials, usually biodegradable, but not always. So sometimes a lot of rock was used. Sometimes some of the plastic kind of geo-web material was used. So there's been a lot of attempts at doing what beaver do, but luckily we have evolved. We've gone into the newer type of beaver mimicry that you've heard about. So these are some more recent structures on at a site we called Upper Dunkard, and it's a small tributary to Rattlesnake Creek. And you can see where we pounded in posts using a hydraulic post pounder with a crew, and stuffed in as much woody debris as we could, along with live stakes, willow live stakes. And I'll talk about those in just a minute. Here's another site on Upper Rattlesnake Creek. And this, a series of about 21 beaver dam analogs were built in 2020. We had the help of the Mount Adams Resource Stewards crew, and the work was done really efficiently, really well. And we're excited to see the results, that the water is being held back, and hopefully the stream can start to aggregate and collect sediment, and that water table can start to rise. And this site, we're really hopeful we can prepare for future beaver reintroduction. So it's just the beginning, but we are hopeful for that outcome. Here's another BDA, beaver dam analog, on the same stream. You can really see how the water's ponding up behind that structure. And here's just a review of some of those terms. I know PALS has been thrown around too. That's post-assisted log structure. So there's a few different terms out there and different types of materials, but for the most part, this type of structure, again, is just really aiming to mimic what beavers do on the landscape. And then vegetation, it's really critical that we also have robust vegetation on these sites. They not only play a really important structural role for the channel, but they obviously provide food and habitat for all the wildlife and birds and species that exist here. So one of the ways to prepare a site for beaver reintroduction is by planting native vegetation and protecting existing native vegetation and really building a robust plant community. Many of these species do respond well to browse. So beavers chewing on things sometimes will help a shrub, you know, sprout new canes and new branches, but having a really robust population to begin with is critical to having successful beaver habitat and successful riparian habitat and stream health overall. So again, UCD, Underwood Conservation District, does have a native plant sale going on now until February 28th. So make sure you've checked out our webpage if you're interested in that. We can also give you lots of tips about how to plant successfully so that you are happy with your purchase and get the results you want. And in this picture here, what you see is a fascine or willow live stake bundle, and it could be more than just willow. Live stakes can consist of species like willow or cottonwood or red osier dogwood. There's a number of species that do respond well to just being cut and buried. So this is a fascine or a bundle of those live stakes that is probably going to be buried into the bank, and they can sprout and create a really nice, thick, dense layer of vegetation. So that's another option for people that may not want to buy plants out of a pot, but or a bare root plant, but can go out and do some cuttings. So I know not everyone has the ability to build beaver habitat in their backyards or on their property. However, there are a lot of things you can do even at a small scale, residential level, to hold water and to improve water quality and support watershed health and habitat. So I'm just throwing this in here as another idea. If you have a backyard with as an area for a rain garden or a swale, there are resources out there for that too, just for a small scale version of a wetland or pond habitat. I do happen to have 5 copies of the Rain Garden Handbook available, hard copies in white salmon. So let me know if you're interested in getting that hard copy. Otherwise, this is also available online. So if I can get my computer to respond, I'll move on. Is that gonna do it? There we go. Great, I think that was my last slide. So we have Margaret here to talk a bit about what her group is up to with beaver and beaver habitat.
And to conclude, right?
That's right, to roll it all up.
Thanks Tova and Jeanette and Alexa, that was great. I think, you know, I think we've heard a lot and seen a lot about how all of the good benefits that can come from both beavers and beaver mimicry type structures. And the pictures here, just another example of a project. This one's on a tributary to the Natchez in the Yakima Basin. So I think the take home message is these projects are happening all over Washington, and it's pretty exciting development and restoration, as is the use of beavers as partner in restoration. And you can just go ahead to the next slide. We're just kind of we know we have a lot of enthusiastic people here. So if you feel inspired about what you've heard, feel free to learn more. We encourage you to learn more. The book in the middle, Eager, will just really open your mind to what our watersheds used to look like and the changes that have occurred with the removal of beaver. And the one on the right there is a video that we really encourage watching. And then there's a lot of actions that you can take. Next slide. I think the very first one should be don't shoot beavers, right? If there's still a lot of beavers being removed lethally, and if you're a landowner or your neighbor has a beaver problem, I think Alexa talked a lot about coexistence strategies, and there's a lot that can be done to keep beavers in place. And then if they do need to be moved, there's opportunities all around the region to move and rehome beavers. And just, if you're not a landowner, just share what you know and help promote the modernization of the policies around beavers in our state and beyond, and just learn and enjoy nature. And I think that is our last slide. So we have some more surveys, and we're gonna move to question and answer really quickly, but this has been really fun. Who's up with a quick poll?
Jan is the poll manager.
Jan, you're still on mute. Oh, here you come.
Sorry. So Tova, you want the poll 3, the perspective now that we're done with our presentations?
Yes, please.
Okay. Here we go, folks. Should be up there for you now to see and vote.
Jan, is this the one about perception of beaver? Because I still don't see it, but that's the one, right?
Yes, yes it is.
The reason we're repeating this is just to see if there happens to be any difference from pre-presentation to post.
Still getting a few votes in here, but we had such a strong response the first time, and it's looking just like that again now. So beneficial keystone species is definitely our winner again here. So we had a couple, or just maybe one person that said others, but keystone species for sure for the win there.
Jan, there's another question to put up there that we thought we'd ask about priorities in the face of climate change, just to kind of gauge the audience on that.
Yep, and we got that one up there now. So another question for your responses here, folks. What is your top priority in climate adaptation?
And this will be our last content related question. Then we will definitely save a little time here for questions and answers with our speakers. And before we completely wrap up, there's one final question about workshop effectiveness. If you hang around long enough, we'd love to hear your response on that. So go ahead, Jan.
Yep, we're just getting some more votes in here on our poll. And we can maybe leave this up for a couple of minutes and move on to some questions and answers. I know there's some conversation going on in the chat right now, and Alexa, you're part of that. I don't know if you wanted to just make some comments or bring anything up from some of the conversation there.
Sure, happy to. Some great questions coming out of the chat. I'm going to start with what's current, and then I'll go backwards a little bit, and people feel free to chime in, unmute yourself or put it in the chat, or I can't see everybody's hands if they're raised, but the latest question was from Ralph, who asked about the genetic diversity in beaver populations across the state. I'm not super versed around all populations of the state, but the Beaver Project, the Methow Beaver Project, was working on identifying the sex of beavers through blood samples when we first got started, so we could pair beavers better. I didn't go into a lot of the relocation details, but sexing beavers is actually quite difficult. And when we capture individual beavers, we always wanted to release them as pairs, so they could be a reproductive pair who might spread beavers across the landscape better. But beavers have internal genitalia, so it's actually quite tricky. And so we took blood samples for quite a while. And in that process, long answer, we did a lot of genetics research with folks at a few different academic universities. And what we found was that a lot of our Methow and Okanagan watershed beavers were similar to Alberta and Western Canada beavers. because in the 1930s, there was a big push with the US Forest Service, 30s, 40s, and 50s. The Forest Service made a big effort to reintroduce beavers to a lot of Western watersheds. And a lot of those beavers came from Canada. Across the state, generally, the genetic diversity hasn't been as critical of an issue around relocation, at least. It's more of what beavers might transport between different watersheds if they're relocated between watersheds. So maybe, Ralph, you could ask me a little more specifically what your interest is around the diversity of the genetics in the state population, or if this was more of a question around relocation across watersheds or even the North Cascades east to west, because there are big issues around that. And Robin just mentions that the Forest Service was airdropping beavers. Yeah, that was in Idaho. That was quite a story out of there. And that was successful in the Frank Church Wilderness, that they reintroduced beavers into that area that have their progeny still live today in that area. But that's not how it's done in the Methow, at least, and probably not too many other watersheds. There was a question around fish passage and beaver dams. Steve brought that up, and another Steve responded with me. Whether beaver dams create challenges to fish passage is very circumstantial. It's assumed that they would, but there's a lot of dynamic processes that happen in our watersheds, especially Western watersheds that are dependent on snowpack. So, and then even more so where you're dependent on rain at different times of the year, quite different than here in the Methow. There's a lot of complexity with seasonal flows, and seasonal flows can make seasonal passage possible, but then there can also be barriers to passage in our very simplified modern landscape and watersheds with human dominance of our riparian systems that don't allow a lot of complexity on the landscape. Humans have very much controlled where water goes, how it goes there, usually as efficiently, conveyed as efficiently as possible for our needs. That's not the way these watersheds evolved before human encroachment on them on a large scale. I mean, we humans need resources too, but we've changed these waterways dramatically that don't allow them to be dynamic systems anymore. So beaver dams can become barriers in very simplified systems. One of the answers to that is where they are, which isn't everywhere. People make assumptions that the dams are barriers no matter what. Even our Colville Tribe's fisheries bios used to go kick out the beaver dams every spring to allow fish passage, but they are changing their tune as they've worked with us, and we've worked with them over time to really study, are these dams barriers? Are they only seasonal barriers? What can we do about seasonal barriers? Can we lower the face of the dam so there's a longer period of fish passage opportunity at high flows with a shorter or lower elevation dam face? There's a lot of options in the short term to work with beavers and their dams where the habitat they're creating, beavers are creating, benefits those salmon for a lot of the year. And then there are certain times of the year where the fish might be perceived as stuck in a place or not able to access a place. But sometimes they are accessing it. And the only way to know that is to study it and to get in there and do snorkel surveys, get in there and do water quality monitoring to know whether you're at lethal levels that couldn't support fish, even if they had been in there. So anyways, there's a lot of complexity to that issue of beaver dams as passage barriers, but it can be true. But oftentimes it is a perception and we don't know if it's actually true. And sometimes it is absolutely not true, even when people say it is. So that's why I say it depends. I probably didn't answer everybody's questions on fish passage, but we are doing a lot of experimentation up here in the Methow with a lot of support around finding answers to those questions and how do we make the habitat more complex to offer resilience and opportunity for fish passage more frequently and in different circumstances. Any other questions? Anybody want to pipe in?
I wanted to maybe just call on Alan real quick. Alan, I think you had your hand up for a bit there, and I don't know if we've answered your question or if you still
Hi,
had a question.
I just put my question into the chat. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
I can read it if you want.
Yeah, go ahead and just
Sure.
ask us. And just real quick, I'm going to start this last poll for folks to look at too while we finish up our Q&A here too.
So can you say a little more about beavers along main stem rivers below the headwaters? I live along the middle part of the Yakima River, and I know that there are beaver active in the main stem channel, and I'm just wondering what you can tell us about them.
I'm assuming you're asking someone in that area, not me.
I can try to answer. Hi, Ellen, also.
Hi.
Paul was mentioning in the chat about beavers using wood that was added in the upper Yakima in Kittitas County, which was really exciting to see restoration projects then kind of being used by beavers, so that beavers could then kind of build on wood that was now placed in the river and side channels. And I think for Mid-Columbia Fisheries and a lot of our partners in restoration, we're really looking at like, can we get beavers reestablished in places that are flow limited in headwaters and smaller streams. Like beavers are certainly living all up and down big rivers and improving habitat on the margins, but they can really do a lot on the smaller and flow limited streams. So that's a real focus, but we certainly see beavers living in a variety of habitats, including like really swift rivers like the Lower White Salmon River.
I would love to address that too, Margaret, now that I understand it's not necessarily a site-specific question, but since beaver extirpation, beavers have started to come back into the landscape since they haven't been pressured as much for trapping over the last several decades. But what we are seeing mostly, at least in our neck of the woods and from all the beaver work I do with working groups across the West in most states, is that beavers are their densest in larger river systems where they are not building dams very frequently, maybe on off-channel habitat, side-channel habitat, and in larger tributaries, same off-channel, side-channel habitat. But they're not necessarily building up populations enough because of challenges with conflicts with humans. Most private land ownership is along the major rivers and larger tributaries. Public lands, upper watersheds are more public lands, but beavers are pretty persecuted for the challenges they bring to private landowners. So those larger populations in the main stem river, what we call river beavers, who aren't building dams and therefore not necessarily doing a ton of habitat complexity building or water storage, that's our population stronghold. We don't have a lot of beavers up in the upper watershed. A lot of that habitat is degraded. They're not going to make it there, even if they do venture up there. But how beavers move into upper watersheds is not from us dropping them off, or, it's not how it happened in the past. They were pushed into that more and more marginal habitat, steeper gradients because of population pressure and being pushed into marginal habitat. So that's one of the challenges and lessons we've learned over the last 15 years. We relocate from private lands onto the upper watershed public lands, and we're seeing over and over and over again very little establishment of beavers. We often get the beavers building dams and holding water, and those often last even without beaver maintenance. But what we're seeing is that they don't establish and start reproducing and dispersing from there because there isn't habitat connectivity. That's a pretty degraded landscape. And if they lose one beaver in a two-pair mated pair, they have to go a long ways to find another beaver, and they're more likely to die from predation in that adventurous effort from how far we took them away from the base population. So in a way, we've created sinks of beaver populations by moving them from these main stem river habitats where they can live pretty easily, even in cold northern climate conditions. They move up and down the rivers. They're not as territorial. They build bank dens. That is good habitat for salmon, but it's not very much of it. So that's where I'm like, this is where the biggest pressure is on our beavers, is in that larger river system, private land ownership along the rivers and tributaries. And we really need to focus on coexistence so we can get beavers being pushed through increasing population into that more marginal habitat and moving them upstream. But in the same time, the same breath, we've got to do the stream restoration in order to accommodate the beavers in that more degraded habitat in more marginal habitat of the upper watershed. So anyways, that's just part of the story. It's not the whole story, but part of it.
I'm in the lower Yakima River area, and I have a question. I've been feeding a local colony of beavers in the below Benton City for a number of years with apples from my fruit trees. Is this a good practice?
Depends on how many orchardists you have around you. If you're giving beavers a taste for apples, I mean, I think it's mostly benign as long as your neighbors aren't impacted by it. It's not the best for beavers, but they generally self-regulate. When we have them in captivity in our hatchery while we're relocating beavers, we try not to feed them a lot of soft fruits because it does just go right through them and dirties up the raceways and stuff like that. But they have a high fiber diet. That cambium of wood is really important for their digestion. So I don't think it's a bad thing as long as your neighbors aren't being impacted by it.
So far, that's the case. My question is, how does it affect the beavers?
I think they self-regulate pretty well with apples. I mean, they'll eat a bunch of them. They might get sick, or like they did in the Dust Bowl, where people were surviving on orchard fruit for a long time. Your digestion doesn't do very well with it for very long. So probably similar to beavers, but again, they have a very different digestive system than we do. They eat wood. So yeah, I don't think it's doing a bad thing at all. I mean, it probably helps you observe the beaver and appreciate them more, which helps spread your investment in them being around. So I think that.
The final question is, I do a lot of topping associated with the fruit trees. Would that be a benefit?
To you or to them?
To them.
Yeah, they eat the wood on it as long as you're not unhappy with them eating the fruit trees. You can protect fruit trees, but an orchardist, protect them with fencing if you don't want them chewed on. If you don't care about them being chewed on, they'll just grow more branches. Fruit trees, a lot of them like to be coppiced to grow more wood. But as long as you're not training them to go to your neighbor who has a commercial orchard, then I don't see any harm in it. But
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Steve's talking about beavers at 7,500 feet in elevation that are removing aspen at an alarming rate. And Steve, I think people aren't used to what beavers do generally. They can remove a lot of wood at one time. And sometimes they do eat themselves out of house and home. I think my experience with beavers over a long period of time now is that their personalities vary just as much as humans do. Some are very delicate, purposeful gardeners of their habitat. Others just mow it down and then move on. There's not a rule book that the beavers are reading as much as we as humans like rules and understanding and a lot of coordination in the things we do. But beavers can decimate the wood in an area. Generally, what I see is that they just hit patches and then move to another patch. But there's a group up at the golf course that we did a coexistence project at that I showed photos of. They are taking the aspen down and they're not eating it. It's kind of like that mass killing, maybe for fun, but yeah, they're taking a lot of aspen down and not utilizing it. And it's challenging. It's hard to justify that to a landowner as something worthwhile when it's not directly benefiting habitat necessarily. But, this is compromise and coexistence and learning, and then fencing more if we want to protect those species. You mentioned high elevation. In Colorado, beavers are generally more frequently found at high elevation rather than in the larger river systems. That's the one exception I've heard of through all my beaver work. Most other Western states, at least the arid portions of those states, they're mostly finding beaver in the main stem rivers and not very many at high elevations without relocation efforts. So hopefully I've answered that question for you. Anyone else have any questions? I mean, there's a lot to be said for coexisting with beavers who change their environment dramatically to suit their needs, which happens to suit a lot of other species needs as well, including our own, increasing in the bounty of aquatic resources, as well as storing that water in a natural way that does support a lot of other species. Concrete dams don't support the same biodiversity that beaver dams do, primarily because of that complexity building and habitat. Dams don't really build complexity. They simplify and deepen water for a while, then they start to gather sediment, make it more shallow. That has to be maintained. It's just not the same sort of water holding response on the landscape. When aspen are cut, they often they don't coppice like willow, but they grow from their roots. That's one of the largest, maybe the largest organism on Earth. There was a debate between a mushroom or a mycelium and aspen grove, but aspens are generally interconnected through their root systems. They're taking over my backyard and into my garden right now. But cutting an aspen down, you're gonna get more aspen coming back. Anyone who's lived through wildfires in the West that's burned through riparian aspen groves, you're getting a forest of aspen afterwards. The next year, even that fall, sometimes a meter high in the first year, and so thick you can't walk through it. So aspen regenerate really well from pressure, as long as it's not every year, like livestock grazing. Livestock will eat young aspen and eventually kill them if it's constant pressure every year. Beavers can do that, but they tend to move on. They cut an aspen down or cut a whole grove down sometimes, and then they move on because they run out of that food and building material to eat. So hopefully that is question answered. One of the things I did want to mention while I have some people's attention is that water quality aspect. There's been a lot of concern, and understandably so, that beavers tend to warm water in their complexes. And there is some great evidence coming out from different researchers across the West that beavers can warm water. That is for sure. Again, it depends on the system that they're working in. We have a system where we have incredibly cold groundwater moving in a gaining reach in a side channel. And the beavers are just moderating that temperature. They've deepened it. And so in the complex habitat that they've created by deepening that channel and creating canals through swimming out into the floodplain safely, they have created so much heterogeneity, so much variation in the habitat that the temperature varies just as much as the habitat does. So you have cold spots, you have warm spots. Those are benefiting different species, but the cold spots are definitely essential for salmon species and juvenile salmon in particular. And we're finding in many of our side channels of anadromous rivers that we are maintaining good water quality, even in this last summer's heat dome, enough to support juvenile salmon rearing, and they aren't trying to leave the system. We did snorkel surveys in August after the hottest period and found temperatures and dissolved oxygen within the survivability zone. They were high, but not lethal. And the fish weren't trying to leave. We only have so many probes out there. There's so much different habitat out there. We don't have a probe in every habitat. So we know they're surviving. They're finding places to live well. So what researchers and we are finding is that there's a lot of variability in a beaver complex for water quality, especially temperature. Okay, yeah, habitat complexity is critical for salmon. One, for water quality issues, one, to evade predation. There's so much to cover that salmon, especially juvenile salmon, really need. Different types of habitats support their prey species, the macroinvertebrates that they rely on. But yeah, escaping predation from larger fish, from all the birds that prey on fish, from the mammals, terrestrial mammals that prey on fish. Yeah, there's a lot of benefit to habitat complexity for salmon. Anyone else have some questions? Okay, Dallas just typed one in. Is there any relationship between global warming, peak high flow, beaver dam height average, adult salmon size? Probably. I think all of those are connected, strongly in some ways and maybe less strongly in others, Dallas, but that's a great question. I definitely think increasing average temperature is contributing to peak high flows coming earlier in a lot of places. We're starting to have bigger fall peaks that we haven't experienced in the last 20 years, which is interesting, mostly because we're getting rain instead of snow in the fall. Normally our mountains would be holding that snow, but it's coming down all the way down the mountains in that period. Beaver dam height. I don't feel like I have enough examples of that one, Dallas, to really answer that one well. I will say down in the anadromous zone where beavers can build a dam, which is not that many places, but a lot of our side channel habitats have levees at the upstream ends. So not a lot, well, some of them do. Those that do can support beavers. Some of them are supporting beavers, and they have built some really big dams. So you might be right, like where beavers have the opportunity in systems that they don't always have many opportunities in, they may build them bigger. But this is also a very narrow outlet, the one I'm speaking of. I'm speaking of one system, one beaver complex. So I don't have a lot of comparables. We don't have that many side channels on our major rivers and tributaries that host dam building beavers, mostly because of the high flows that occur and blow their dams out if they do try to build them. So they're mostly living in bank dens and moving around a fair bit. So, but the one that we are keeping a really close eye on, it was pretty big. And that's where we put a flow device in, and we brought the face of the dam down, and I can't see my hands very well, but we lowered the surface water elevation. We lowered the dam face, or the freeboard of the dam, to match the new surface water elevation. And the beavers have been living with it for 2 years now really well. Adult salmon size, I think that has a lot to do with ocean harvest, of course, and then the number that get back and actually have success in rearing and then returning to the ocean, or going to the ocean as juveniles. There's so many challenges to salmon throughout their life cycle, but it seems like ocean conditions are really hammering them, and commercial harvest. So, yeah, population control.
I think we're going to start wrapping it up here. I know there's always more to talk about. And I really encourage everyone to reach out individually. If you have a follow-up question or a specific question about your location, your property, or something you've seen out there, please follow up with one of us. If our contact information is on the slide right now, but if I can point you into the right direction or get you connected with one of the other speakers, I will. So I think we are at that point. I don't mean to cut anyone off. And Alexa, I know you could probably teach years of lessons on beaver. It's amazing to have some insight into your expertise. So thank you so much for sharing that tonight. Thank you, Margaret and Jeanette, for your contributions and presentations tonight. Thank you, Jan, for the background moderation and navigation through this. Yeah, we are looking forward to our next workshops next month. I know Margaret is hoping some of you will also register for hers, so take a look for those. And with that, we just want to thank you again for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you soon. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Tova and Jeanette and Margaret, so much. Great work
Thanks
you're doing.
to the presenters and the hosts, and to everybody for attending. Awesome turnout. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Good night.